Before I start, let me introduce myself. My name is Timotheos Dante, and today I will talk about the history of African Union. I divide this presentation into three parts. The first one is the establishment of Organization of African Unity. The second one is the aims and objectives of the Organization of African Unity. And the third one is the dissolution of Organization of African Unity. So let's jump to the first section, the establishment of the Organization of African Unity. The African Union was formed after the dissolution of the Organization of African Unity in 2002. The Organization of African Unity itself was formed in 25 May 1963, when many African leaders wanted to accelerate the process of European decolonization and gain independence for several of new nations. The Organization of African Unity also wanted to promote peaceful solution regarding conflicts, ensuring sovereignty, and raise living standards in Africa region. However, the Organization of African Unity was largely criticized from the beginning. Some countries still had deep ties to its colonial master. Many countries associated themselves with the ideologies of either the United States or the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War. The process of colonization in Africa that commenced in the 1950s witnessed the birth of many new states in Africa region. Inspired by the philosophy of Pan-Africanism, the states of Africa saw through a political collective, a means of preserving and consolidating their independence and pursuing the ideals of African unity. However, two rival camps emerged with opposing views about how these goals should be achieved. The first group is the Casablanca Group, that led by President Kwame Nkrumah from Ghana. He supported radical calls for political integration and the creation of a supranational body. And then the second group is the moderate Monrovia Group, that led by Emperor Haile Selassie from Ethiopia. He advocated a loose association of sovereign states that allowed for political cooperation at the intergovernmental level. The Organization of African Unity was therefore based on the sovereign equality of all member states, as stated in its charter. The aims and objectives of Organization of African Unity itself are stated in Organization of African Unity Charter Article number 2, that said the organization purposes is to, first, promote the unity and solidarity of the African states, second, to coordinate and intensify their cooperation and efforts for the betterment of people of Africa, third, to defend their sovereignty, their territorial integrity, and their independence, fourth, to eradicate all forms of colonialism in Africa, and fifth, to promote international cooperation having due regard to the Charter of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this can be achieved by calling on member states to recognize, first, the sovereign equality of member states, second, non-interference in the internal affairs of each state, and third, respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of each state, fourth, peaceful settlement of disputes by negotiation, fifth, unreserved condemnation in all its forms of subversive activities on the part of neighboring states or any other states. 6. Absolute dedication to the total emancipation of the African territories which were still dependent. 7. Affirmation of a policy of non-alignment with regard to all other blocs. The last section is the dissolutions of the Organization of African Unity. The Organization of African Unity had a mixed record. Its greatest success was in relation to the colonization. Other achievements included making significant contributions to the development of international law, especially in the fields of refugee law and human rights law, where several important treaties were adopted under Organization of African Unity auspice. Although in practice, the progress was slow and uneven. There are also efforts to promote economic cooperations in Africa, and in 1991, it was decided to set up an African Economic Community, which in time was intended to lead to a custom union, a common market, and African Monetary Union. But in the end, the failures of the Organization of African Unity outweighed its successes. Arguably, its major failing was its inability to bring peace, prosperity, security, and stability to Africa. The Organization of Africa Unity was found wanting in its responses to the tyrannies and kleptocracies ruining Africa, a deficiency that undermined its credibility. That's all from me. The next section, which is the establishment of African Union, will be presented by my friend Nimade Cikhara Sriwidyaswari.
Before I start, let me introduce myself. My name is Cikhara Sriwidyaswari, and I will be presenting the establishment of African Union. This presentation will be divided into 5 sections, which are established date, membership, African Union structure, the assembly, and vision of 2063. The first is the established date. On September 9, 1999, the heads of state and government of the Organization of African Unity, or OAU, issued the Certain Declaration calling for the establishment of an African Union with a view to accelerating the process of integration in the continent to enable Africa to play its rightful role in the global economy while addressing multifaceted social, economic, and political problems compounded as they were by certain negative aspects of globalization. The African Union, or AU, was officially launched in July 9, 2002 in Durban, South Africa. The decision to relaunch is that, in order to realize Africa's potential, there was a need to refocus attention from the fight for decolonization and ridding the continent of apartheid, which had been the focus of the OAU, towards increased cooperation and integration of African states to drive Africa's growth and economic development. Next is the membership of AU. There are 3 requirements for the membership of AU. First, a state should be an African state. Second, a simple majority of member states supports the application for membership. And the last is the African state should sign and ratify the AU Constitutive Act. Several countries have at various times been suspended for membership of the AU. Suspension is the AU's usual response to any interruption for constitutional rule by a member. All AU member states have the same rights and obligation. The Constitutive Act does not provide for a veto power or any kind of special status for any member state of the AU. Withdrawal of membership is allowed after a member state notifies in writing its intention to renounce its membership of the Union to the chairperson of the AU Commission, who will communicate such notification to the other state parties of the Constitutive Act. As of January 2017, there are 55 membership of the AU in total, as shown in the presentation. Next is the African Union structure. In structure, the OAU began as one entity, whereas the AU, integrating itself with the African Economic Community and building other structures, consists of the Assembly, the supreme policy and decision-making organ; the Executive Council coordinates and makes decisions on common policies; the specialized technical committees responsible to assist the Executive Council in substantive matters; the Permanent Representatives Committee, charged with preparing the work of the Executive Council; the Peace and Security Council makes decisions on prevention, management, and resolution of conflicts. The Commission is the AU Secretariat. The Pan-African Parliament, platform for people from all African states to participate in discussions and decision-making on issues facing the continent. The Economic, Social, and Cultural Council, advisory organ that provides opportunity for African civil society organizations to contribute to AU's principles, policies, and programs. The judicial, human rights, and legal organs ensures compliances with the law. The financial institution consists of the African Central Bank, the African Monetary Fund, and the African Investment Bank. African peer review mechanism aims to foster the adoption of policies, values, standards, and practices of political and economic governance that lead to political stability and accelerated economic integration. And the last is the regional economic communities, facilitates regional economic integration between members and through the wider African Economic Community, or AEC. Next is the Assembly. The AU Assembly is the supreme decision-making organ of the Union. It is composed of the heads of state and government of all member states of the African Union or their accredited representatives. The Assembly meets at least once in a year in an ordinary session and convenes for an extraordinary meeting at the request of a member state and upon the approval of 2/3 majority of member states. The sessions of the Assembly are to be held at the AU headquarters in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. However, the Assembly can hold its session elsewhere if a member state extends invitation to host the session. The The inviting state should not be under sanction from the AU and should be able to meet predetermined criteria such as paying up all financial obligations to the Union and maintaining favorable political atmosphere. The Assembly should hold at least one session at the headquarters of the Union every other year based on its calendar. The decisions of the Assembly are made either by consensus or by two-thirds majority of the member states of the Union. The Assembly is led by a chairperson elected among the heads of state or government for a period of 1 year. The chairperson of the Assembly is generally elected after consultations among member states and based on the principle of rotation. The chairperson of the Assembly is assisted by the bureau for each summit, composed of 14 vice chairpersons elected based on geographical distribution and due consultations. The chairperson is responsible to convene the sessions of the Assembly, guide the proceedings of the Assembly, rule on point of order, and in consultation with the chairperson of the Commission represents the Union in between sessions. It monitors the implementation of policies and decisions by its organs and takes decisions on reports and recommendations from its organs, such as a recommendation for intervention in member states from the Peace and Security Council. In particular, the Assembly directs the Executive Council, the Peace and Security Council, and the Commission on Management of Conflicts, Acts of Terrorism, and Emergency Situations. The Assembly is mandated to impose sanctions on member states for violation of the principle enshrined in the Constitutive Act. Moreover, the Assembly adopts the budget of the Union and appoints and removes the judges to both the African Human Rights Court and the African Court of Justice and Human Rights when operational. And the last is the structure, functions, and regulations of the AU Commission. The administrative wing of the organization is determined by the Assembly. The Assembly appoints the chairperson of the Commission and his or her deputies as well as all other commissioners of the Union and determines their functions, terms of office. The last section is Vision 2063. Another important innovation of AU is Agenda 2063. Adopted by the heads of state and governments of the EU during the 24th Ordinary Assembly held in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia in January 2015, Agenda 2063 is a strategic framework for the socio-economic transformation of the continent over the next 50 years. It builds on and seeks to accelerate the implementation of past and existing continental initiatives for growth and sustainable development, such as the Lagos Plan of Action, the Abuja Treaty, the Minimum Integration Program, the Program for Infrastructural Development in Africa, the Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program, and the New Partnership for Africa's Development. And the last is, Agenda 2063 is Africa's strategic framework that aims to deliver on the goals of inclusive and sustainable development and is a concrete manifestation of the Pan-African drive for unity, self-determination, freedom, progress, and collective prosperity pursued under Pan-Africanism and African Renaissance. It is anchored on the AU Constitutive Act, AU Vision, AU Assembly's 50th Anniversary Solemn Declaration of 2013, and 7 African Aspirations for 2063 and sets out a national, regional, and continental blueprint for progress.
Good day, Ms. Ruby. My name is Famitha Latif, and I'll be explaining about the actions that the AU has done after its establishment in the recent years. Now, the AU supports political and economic integration among its 54 member states. It aims to boost development, eradicate poverty, and bring Africa into the global economy. Now, the AU had succeeded the Organization of African Unity, or OAU, in 2002. In its later years, the OAU, which originated in the decolonization struggles of the early 1960s, had been criticized for becoming a mere talking shop. So, it was conceived by the then Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi as the United States of Africa. Its structure is loosely modeled on that of the European Union. It inaugurated a Pan-African Parliament in March 2004, one of the number of proposed institutions. The body debates continent-wide issues and advises AU heads of state. There are far-reaching plans to set up a human rights court, a central bank and monetary fund, and by 2023, an African economic community with a single currency. So, as we know, that African Union is actually thriving to be similar to how the European Union itself is, with the point of having a human rights court, a central bank and monetary fund, and also planning on establishing a single currency for the entirety of the African Union itself. The African Union had been facing a lot of critics, and the critics have questioned whether the AU can be more effective than its predecessor. They point out that many of its leaders are the same people who presided over the OAU, or the Organization of African Unity, an organization that became known as a dictators' club. The AU came in for criticism over its failure to act earlier over the civil war in Libya. There was talk about the AU Commission under Gabon's Jean Ping had not given sufficient backing to the South African-sponsored peace plan, which itself was criticized for not requiring Muammar Gaddafi to step down, who was the then Libyan leader. And lastly, the Libya dispute prompted the ultimately successful challenge to Mr. Ping from South Africa's Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, the wife of President Jacob Zuma, for the post of Commission chairperson. Thus, that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much, and I apologize if there are any mistakes in advance.